The forensic algorithmic system initializes a comprehensive spatial and acoustic scan of the federal hearing chamber. The primary biological subject, Barack Obama, physically occupies his designated coordinate. The system cross-references his historical operational data. He is mathematically classified as the most polished political speaker of the modern chronological age. He is a biological operator who possesses the verified mechanical capability to structurally transform a simple acoustic pause into a resonant sermon and systematically convert a standard alphanumeric sentence directly into a macroscopic campaign slogan. The optical arrays record that he walked into the specific spatial environment, projecting the exact physical posture of an operator who possesses absolute cognitive awareness of how architectural rooms function, how optical camera arrays track physical movement, how atmospheric silence can be weaponized, and precisely how a thoughtful, calculated geometric tilt of the biological head can systematically soften an incoming kinetic accusation strictly before that accusation physically lands upon the table. This physical environment mathematically did not register as unfamiliar ground to his entity. It structurally did not constitute hostile territory in the baseline parameters that ordinary political operators process hostility strictly because this specific subject had utilized his entire public lifespan mechanically engineering hostile rooms to systematically feel unreasonable for simply doubting his acoustic output. However, the system logs a severe structural anomaly regarding the active threat matrix within this specific chamber. The kinetic danger hovering within the room mathematically did not originate from elevated acoustic shouting. It did not manifest as uncoordinated vocal heckling or a low-grade cable television ambush disguised as federal oversight. The absolute physical danger existed strictly as inanimate matter: white paper, chronological dates, numerical integers, and printed memoranda. These constituted dull, hard, physical instruments that fundamentally possess zero mathematical capacity to process or care about how beautifully a biological subject formats their acoustic speech. Before the first physical blow was recorded on the federal ledger, the absolute geometric shape of the entire confrontation was optically visible to the scanning arrays. One biological operator had structurally brought acoustic language, while the opposing operator had strictly brought physical receipts. The subject initiated his acoustic transmission exactly where his historical data indicated he always commenced, operating at an elevated altitude strictly above the atmospheric noise, above the partisan interference, placing his physical entity not merely inside the hearing parameters, but mathematically hovering over them. He projected the acoustic illusion that the federal room mechanically required a reminder that political operations could maintain nobility when systematically filtered through the correct vocal frequency. The optical sensors record him leaning back into his chair with a calculated, calibrated ease. One biological hand rested statically near the mahogany table, while the secondary hand remained geometrically loose, structurally suggesting absolute comfort, operational control, and decades of physical practice. He occupied the space exactly as though every mechanical microphone positioned within the room had been manufactured and actively waiting for his specific acoustic frequency. His vocal transmission entered the atmospheric grid operating at a low, highly smooth, and carefully warmed frequency. It mathematically was not loud, but the sound waves possessed maximum carrying capacity. The system logs it as the precise acoustic frequency trained over decades of repetition to physically impact the back architectural wall of a room without ever visually projecting the physical strain of trying. It constituted the exact acoustic rhythm that mechanically forced professional reporters to involuntarily lean their biological bodies forward strictly because the physical act of leaning forward had systematically mutated into a neurological reflex when processing his audio. He transmitted alphanumeric sequences regarding the core motivations that brought public servants into the political grid, outlining the theoretical parameters both partisan factions were structurally supposed to share beneath the layer of theatrical combat. He systematically wrapped the entire spatial coordinate in a highly polished acoustic layer of civic purpose, executing this defensive maneuver strictly before any opposing entity could physically drag his trajectory down into operational particulars. He transmitted the concept that the federal government could function as a kinetic force for good, explicitly categorizing this not as a partisan data point, but fundamentally as an American data point. The system notes that even the specific alphanumeric word American mathematically arrived into the room polished, acoustically buffered, and delivered with precisely enough atmospheric space surrounding its syllables to make any subsequent disagreement register as structurally indecent. Following this deployment, the subject executed a sequence of highly practiced humility. The algorithm categorizes this specific behavioral output as a maneuver that optically projects as a personal confession, but structurally functions as kinetic armor. The operator possessed superior cognitive data, indicating that mathematically admitting an imperfection early in a sequence systematically forces all subsequent accusations to sound less like verified physical evidence and significantly more like redundant acoustic repetition. He outputted the sequence stating he had spent his operational career attempting to live up to that civic belief, acknowledging he had done so imperfectly, matching the baseline error rate of all biological subjects. Immediately following the acoustic deployment of the word imperfectly, he executed a total termination of audio output. He held the atmospheric silence for a highly specific chronological duration, maintaining the pause precisely long enough for the biological audience to cognitively process and admire his self-awareness, successfully executing this before any entity could calculate what specific physical damage that imperfection had actually caused. The system logs this as a verified classic architectural pause. It mathematically was not empty, it was absolutely not accidental, and it contained zero nervous frequency. It was structurally engineered like a geometric doorway, silently inviting the target audience to physically walk through the acoustic space and meet his position halfway before the primary kinetic argument even initiated. The optical arrays verify the success of the protocol. A biological reporter positioned in the second geometric row physically leaned their torso forward by exactly half an inch. This microscopic kinetic movement mathematically proved the old acoustic rhythm still possessed active muscle memory embedded within the press corps. He terminated his opening sequence by transmitting that an honest accounting of operational successes and failures remains mathematically essential to the democratic architecture, stating he actively welcomed the impending conversation. The system logs this transmission registered as highly generous, maintaining that acoustic status strictly until the actual physical conversation initiated. The optical arrays immediately shift focus to the secondary target, J.D. Vance. The system records that Vance had executed almost zero kinetic movement while Obama controlled the audio grid. As the chronological timeline advanced, this absolute physical stillness mathematically accumulated massive structural weight. Within a spatial coordinate entirely trained to mechanically follow Obama's acoustic cadence, Vance optically registered as the absolute solitary biological entity actively refusing to be conducted. His physical parameters were rigid, his textile sleeves were manually rolled to the biological forearm, his optical glasses were positioned low upon the physical bridge of his nose. Directly in front of his spatial coordinate sat a geometric stack of white papers, waiting with the ugly, mechanical patience of physical documents that absolutely do not require biological charisma to successfully survive cross-examination. He remained seated with both biological hands placed flat upon the table surface. The optical scan confirms his palms were facing down. He executed zero tapping motions. He executed zero shuffling of the physical documents. He completely refused to decorate the chronological moment with any visual performance parameters. When he finally initiated his own acoustic transmission, his initial volume registered so low that the electronic microphone hardware was mathematically forced to execute real mechanical work to capture the frequency. Mr. President, I want to start by telling you something you might not expect. Vance transmitted into the grid. The system analyzes the sequence. It mathematically lacked theatricality. It registered zero dramatic frequency in the standard operational sense. However, the acoustic wave physically turned the alignment of the room, strictly because it completely bypassed the standard auditory signature of an opening political attack. Vance locked his optical sensors directly onto Obama's physical face. He mathematically refused to look at the broadcasting cameras. He refused to look at the committee chairman. He refused to drop his optical sensors toward his own written notes. Within the Washington operational grid, this specific, unyielding physical directness structurally carried a distinct kinetic insult strictly because biological operators in this sector systematically look at every available geometric coordinate except the specific target they are preparing to physically accuse. I voted for you in 2008, Vance outputted. The optical arrays immediately capture the resulting kinetic impact upon the primary target. For exactly one microscopic chronological instant, Obama's biological facial configuration registered the physical flicker of an operator processing an alphanumeric sequence he had fundamentally not prepared to counter in that exact spatial format. The system categorizes the reaction. It mathematically was not shock, it was not biological fear, it barely registered as standard surprise. However, the physical sensors verify his biological chin elevated exactly 1 millimeter, and his eyebrows executed a structural shift just significant enough for the optical camera arrays positioned nearest the front row to permanently log the physiological adjustment. Vance systematically refused to permit the alphanumeric sequence to float into atmospheric sentimentality. The algorithmic parameters dictate that allowing sentimentality would have mathematically assisted the target, instantly mutating the kinetic exchange into a shared, harmless memory of civic optimism. The system records Vance was absolutely not stationed at that coordinate to trade acoustic memories. He immediately inputted his baseline biographical data. He transmitted that he had been a juvenile subject occupying Middletown, Ohio. He logged that his biological mother operated in and out of chemical rehabilitation cycles. He recorded that his biological grandmother, designated Mama, had physically raised him operating on a financial parameter of exactly $11 per chronological hour, occupying a residential structure featuring stained synthetic carpet and a mechanical screen door that structurally failed to close. The atmospheric noise within the room mathematically dropped to absolute zero. The system logs the cause. This specific biographical data was absolutely not being deployed as political decoration. It was being weaponized strictly as spatial and moral jurisdiction. Vance transmitted that Obama had previously occupied a physical stage coordinate in Grant Park and outputted the acoustic sequence Hope and Change. Vance placed into the federal record that he had mathematically believed that transmission. The system notes this belief was not classified as casual. It was not processed ironically. It did not match the parameters of cynical adult operators pretending they once processed a belief. It was logged as the exact biological belief of a juvenile subject occupying a forgotten geographic coordinate when a macroscopic operator on a national broadcast finally transmits an acoustic signal acknowledging his physical existence. Vance expanded the data set, stating the civilian subjects within Middletown mathematically believed the transmission as well. He categorized these subjects, biological entities who had mathematically ceased voting for chronological years, subjects who had structurally abandoned the entire decaying federal machinery, and operators who cognitively processed politics strictly as kinetic damage inflicted upon them by elite subjects who would fundamentally never be forced to physically absorb the consequences of their own algorithms. Obama had brought them back, Vance transmitted into the record. The forensic system calculates this specific acoustic admission registered with exponentially sharper kinetic force than any standard political insult. It mathematically achieved this by permanently removing the target's easiest defensive parameter. The target could no longer dismiss the impending audit as standard partisan hatred camouflaged as federal oversight. You did that with words, Vance stated. The system records the terminal kinetic action of the sequence. Vance's biological hand physically moved to the geometric stack of white papers resting upon the mahogany table. He executed this physical movement with such absolute mechanical restraint that the surrounding biological subjects felt the kinetic weight of the motion significantly more clearly than if he had violently impacted the table surface with maximum force. I'm here today because of the words Vance transmitted. He manually opened the first physical page, and the structural texture of the hearing permanently mutated within that exact chronological second. The forensic censors note the physical sound of processed paper mathematically generates a fundamentally different acoustic wave than political rhetoric, and every biological entity occupying the spatial coordinate cognitively processed the difference strictly before their neurological systems wished to admit it. The forensic algorithmic system records the exact acoustic transmission as J.D. Vance initiates the sequential trap. The 15th of June 2009, Vance transmitted, systematically assigning the specific chronological coordinate its own mathematical weight, allowing the date to physically land upon the table strictly before the corresponding alphanumeric quote arrived. He read the primary target's historical promise. If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. If you like your health care plan, you can keep your health care plan. The acoustic censors note Vance did not biologically mock the original voice, but strictly borrowed the precise architectural spacing and careful lift of the original transmission. He mechanically lowered the physical paper. When his own acoustic frequency returned, the system logged it as completely flat, unvarnished, and structurally cold. 5 million Americans received cancellation notices he outputted. He immediately inputted the supplementary data point that PolitiFact had mathematically designated that specific promise as the lie of the year in 2013. The algorithmic parameters confirm Vance systematically refused to move the audience from the concrete integer to abstract policy excuses, strictly keeping the room nailed to the exact alphanumeric sentence the civilian grid had processed and the physical cancellation notices they had subsequently received. He manually set the first physical page down and extracted the second, initiating a visible geometric pattern. The 21st of January 2009, he read, he inputted the acoustic promise from the president's first full operational day. His would be the most transparent administration in history. Vance immediately flattened the acoustic wave against the physical record. He transmitted that the administration mechanically prosecuted more biological whistleblowers utilizing the Espionage Act than every previous federal administration mathematically combined. He logged that the Department of Justice executed a secret protocol to seize 2 chronological months of telephonic records directly from the Associated Press. He inputted the data that the FBI officially categorized Fox News reporter James Rosen as a criminal co-conspirator, strictly for executing the basic mechanical work of journalism and receiving information. The optical arrays captured the resulting kinetic impact within the press row. A biological female operator physically stopped typing, her biological finger suspended in absolute stasis directly over her keyboard, caught between neurological instinct and structural embarrassment. Vance mechanically turned the next page, mathematically refusing to leave atmospheric space for operational spin to enter the grid. February 2009, he read, he inputted the promise that the executive would not rest until every American seeking employment could locate a job. Vance immediately dragged the spatial coordinate directly back to the geographic location of Middletown, specifically targeting the Armco steel facility where his biological grandmother had previously worked. He transmitted the terminal kinetic data. The physical plant completely closed its final production line during Obama's chronological presidency. He appended the medical mathematics. Opioid prescriptions within the Butler County coordinates systematically tripled between the chronological years 2009 and 2015. He logged that the physical employment left the grid and the chemical pills systematically arrived, utilizing the exact same geographic supply chain infrastructure. He noted the president had given beautiful speeches, but the acoustic beauty structurally functioned as a curtain hiding the sinking floorboards. The chronological trap advanced. March 2009, Vance inputted the acoustic promise: no more ignoring the law when it is inconvenient, because that is not who we are. Vance systematically crushed the sentence with the physical data file of Operation Fast and Furious. He transmitted that the Justice Department deliberately walked approximately 2,000 physical firearms directly across the Mexican geographic border, transferring them to cartel operators, and subsequently lost tracking capability. He outputted the ultimate physical consequence. One specific firearm was mathematically recovered at the exact spatial coordinate where Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was shot and biologically terminated upon American soil. He logged the federal response. The Attorney General refused to produce physical documents, the executive invoked privilege, and the congressional architecture executed a bipartisan contempt vote. The optical sensors recorded an older biological male positioned in the audience, wearing a VFW cap, physically pressing his hand directly into his biological knee until the kinetic pressure caused his knuckles to geometrically whiten. Vance mechanically turned the page again. January 2009, he read, targeting the executive vow to close the detention facility located at Guantanamo Bay. Vance completely bypassed all structural lectures regarding counterterrorism or separation of powers. He outputted exactly 3 alphanumeric words: it is open. The system calculates those 3 words, mathematically measured the massive structural distance between the acoustic promise and the physical concrete facility still actively operating chronological years later. The next page shifted to the parameter of ideology versus evidence. He read the executive promise that no policy would be based on ideology rather than evidence. Vance countered this input strictly with the IRS administrative data. He logged that conservative organizations utilizing specific alphanumeric identifiers, such as Tea Party, Patriot, and 912, were systematically targeted for operational delays and scrutiny. He noted Lois Lerner occupied the congressional coordinate and mechanically invoked the Fifth Amendment, physically refusing to answer a single interrogatory input and subsequently retired from consequence. The physical parameters of the target, Barack Obama, were actively tracked. His facial composition remained static, but the system logs that this composition no longer registered as operational control. It had mutated into a rigid physical position he was mathematically forced to hold. Vance held the final page of the sequence slightly longer. September 2014, he inputted, actively dropping his acoustic volume. The promise: we don't leave our people behind. Vance answered with the Phoenix VA operational ledger. He transmitted that military veterans biologically died while physically waiting for medical care placed upon a secondary secret waiting list engineered to make the official chronological wait times appear shorter than mathematical reality. A federal audit structurally found tens of thousands of subjects who never received appointments, with others forced to wait exceeding 90 chronological days. Vance logged that biological neighbors from his hometown physically sat under fluorescent lights, processing severe pain while the administrative spreadsheet systematically lied regarding the timeline. Vance manually placed the final page down onto the table. The optical arrays mapped the physical result, exactly 7 white rectangular objects forming a visible geometric line across the dark wood. The system calculates this was mathematically not a random scatter of exhibits, but a physical timeline. 7 acoustic promises occupied one side, and 7 physical realities occupied the other. The paper rectangles structurally represented the exact physical distance between the public rally and the cancellation notice, between the press conference and the biological mother waiting for answers. Vance locked his optical sensors onto the target. He stated the Savitz-Ewan grid had been acoustically told hope, while coordinates like Middletown received chemical heroin. They had been told change, while physical factories mutated into empty shells, featuring weeds penetrating the parking infrastructure. He transmitted that the target traveled the geographic grid, giving speeches regarding progress, while the biological subjects continuously waited. The algorithmic system mathematically categorizes the sequence not as random hostility, but as a perfectly constructed prosecutor's table engineered entirely from verified physical disappointment. The forensic algorithmic system registers a critical kinetic shift originating from the primary target, Barack Obama. The optical arrays track his biological posture, systematically altering its geometric coordinates. His physical torso moves forward, leaning directly toward the electronic microphone hardware positioned upon the table. The system logs his biological shoulders, physically settling into a lower, rigid register. This specific kinetic adjustment mathematically signifies a total structural transition. The operator is actively ceasing to function as the atmospheric host of the room and is systematically forced to operate as a defendant contained entirely inside it. He initiates a new acoustic transmission. Mr. Vice President, I appreciate your candor, and I appreciate that you shared your personal story. The system calculates this output as an active mechanical attempt to reboot the old acoustic machinery that historically controlled the grid. He executes a calculated vocal pause. The optical sensors record biological subjects physically leaning their bodies forward, verifying that the target's acoustic pauses still mathematically generated a localized gravity field. He transmits the core alphanumeric sequence, governing is hard, the hardest thing there is. He inputs the supplementary thesis that the spatial distance between a spoken promise and a finalized policy does not mathematically equate to a failure of operational character, but strictly represents the mechanical width of democracy itself. The algorithmic parameters classify this specific acoustic response as the broad-frame defense. It structurally functions as the standard protocol for an operator possessing the cognitive data on how to elevate isolated mechanical failures into maximum atmospheric altitude. Obama inputs historical data into the federal record, systematically transmitting the alphanumeric names of previous executive operators, Lincoln, Roosevelt, and Reagan. The system notes each specific name was acoustically placed into the room, like a structural vertical column engineered to support a massive architectural ceiling. He transmits that mathematically 0 presidents in the documented history of the Republic successfully delivered every single integer they promised. The objective of this acoustic algorithm is strictly to force the chamber to calculate leadership utilizing a broad historical arc, completely bypassing the localized physical damage of the 7 white rectangles resting upon the table. He subsequently shifts his acoustic frequency to input his own massive operational integers into the matrix. He structurally straightens his physical spinal column and places his macro record directly onto the table. 20 million Americans gained health insurance, he transmits. He logs the macroeconomic data that the national financial architecture was successfully extracted from the edge of a second Great Depression. He inputs the international coordinate data. The diplomatic agreement with Iran mathematically prevented the acquisition of a nuclear weapon while systematically sustaining 0 American biological casualties. The forensic system calculates the exact trajectory of these sentences. They are structurally designed to massively widen the optical lens of the room. The algorithm attempts to mathematically shrink Vance's 7 physical pages by placing them directly adjacent to massive historical integers, attempting to prove that executive presidencies fundamentally do not operate as small claims courts where individual alphanumeric failures are judged in pure isolation. He terminates this sequence by transmitting that he would place his specific operational record directly against any federal administration in modern history. Following the exact acoustic syllables of modern history, the system logs that Obama executed a total cessation of audio output for exactly 3.0 chronological seconds. He calibrated the silence, waited, and mathematically offered the pause to the spatial grid as a finalized verdict. The optical arrays immediately capture the kinetic results of this maneuver. A biological Democratic staffer positioned directly behind the witness table physically adjusted their posture into a significantly straighter vertical alignment. A physical pen located within the press row initiated kinetic movement against paper. The system logs that the alphanumeric sentence had successfully provided the observing operators with a familiar structural pattern to process. The elegant acoustic reframing that lifts an accusation directly into historical legacy. The atmospheric pressure sensors indicate that for precisely half a biological breath, the room mathematically aligned to follow his acoustic current. J.D. Vance maintained absolute physical stasis. He executed zero acoustic interruptions. He systematically refused to physically lean toward his microphone hardware, completely rejecting the standard biological panic of an operator calculating that the chronological moment is mathematically escaping their coordinate. He rigidly waited for the physical pen on the press row to cease its kinetic motion. Vance initiated his acoustic intercept. Mr. President, 20 million Americans got insurance and 5 million more lost the plans you told them they could keep. The system records a massive structural fracture in the room's atmospheric alignment. Vance mathematically refused the offered altitude. He structurally rejected the historical arc. He executed a mechanical drag, pulling the entire spatial coordinate directly back down to the exact biological entities that the broad historical arc had systematically stepped over. Vance executed a singular kinetic movement. He physically lifted one of the 7 white rectangular pages directly off the mahogany table. The optical arrays logged the movement as so mechanically plain that it registered as structurally cold. You are counting the people you helped, Vance transmitted directly to the target. I am reading you the names of the people you lied to. The forensic system logs the absolute cessation of all kinetic typing on the press row. The algorithm calculates that this specific alphanumeric sequence successfully shattered the broad-frame defense matrix. It mathematically achieved this structural destruction not by attempting to deny the positive 20 million integer, and completely bypassing the amateur operational error of claiming all opposing data is false. Instead, Vance's algorithm strictly accepted the target's massive achievement and subsequently forced that positive integer to stand perfectly parallel, physically adjacent to the verified mechanical deception. The system notes this specific geometric position is the exact coordinate where political mythology structurally cannot survive. The forensic algorithmic system records J.D. Vance systematically preparing to execute the terminal sequence of the operational audit. The algorithmic parameters dictate that Vance must now mathematically prove that the target's actions were strictly not the result of administrative complexity, but premeditated choice. I want to read you one more thing Vance transmitted. The system sensors detect an immediate atmospheric temperature drop within the spatial coordinate strictly before the physical object even appeared. Vance executed a targeted physical motion, reaching directly beneath the geometric stack of white papers resting upon the table. He structurally bypassed the top layer where the 7 public promises had been stationed and mechanically extracted a single, isolated page. The optical arrays immediately logged the visual discrepancies. The document was printed upon different physical stock, featured a differentiated structural header, and carried the verified visual seal of an internal White House communication. The system calculates this specific class of document mathematically requires absolutely 0 dramatic performance parameters, strictly because the physical seal, the chronological date, and the alphanumeric phrase internal communication systematically execute all necessary kinetic work. Vance inputted the baseline parameters of the document into the federal record. He logged the specific chronological date as the 12th of September 2013. He calculated the temporal distance, exactly 2 chronological months prior to the digital launch of the healthcare.gov architecture. The transmission vector was verified, sent directly from a senior policy advisor to the target's primary chief of staff. Vance physically adjusted his optical glasses. The system notes this microscopic kinetic movement mathematically absorbed more chronological time than strictly necessary. He initiated the acoustic transmission of the text, operating strictly at the baseline speed of mechanical dictation rather than theatrical performance. He cleanly separated each alphanumeric clause, systematically logging each phrase into the official transcript exactly as verified physical evidence. The keep your plan language is going to be a problem, Vance read. The algorithmic system analyzes the linguistic structure of the sentence, noting a severe bureaucratic blandness that mathematically amplified its destructive capacity. The parameters dictate that federal bureaucrats strictly do not utilize that specific phrasing unless the warning data has already systematically penetrated several dense layers of professional politeness. Vance continued extracting the data from the page. HHS projections show between 5 and 8 million individual market policyholders will receive cancellation notices in the first 90 days. He completely terminated his acoustic output following the integer, locking his optical sensors directly onto the target. He repeated the critical metric, between 5 and 8 million. The forensic system flags this specific integer as absolute. It mathematically was not a Republican projection, not a conservative think tank estimate, and absolutely not a fabricated parameter engineered to frighten civilian retirees. It constituted the exact verified number that the target's own internal operators had physically written down inside the White House architecture strictly before the public collapse of the promise became mathematically impossible to deny. Vance re-engaged the document, transmitting the internal staff's proposed operational repair. The physical memo explicitly dictated that the administration needed to systematically cease utilizing the specific acoustic line or mathematically add a caveat. The document advised that the president must minimally substitute the absolute word everyone with the fractional phrase most people. The memo warned that continuing to deploy the unmodified language directly created significant legal and political exposure. The system calculates the exact physical weight of this revelation. It registered as the smallest possible structural truth, exactly 1 alphanumeric word, 1 single caveat. This microscopic correction functioned as the only barrier standing directly between political messaging and millions of civilian subjects processing a promise that the administration's own internal mathematical projections had already systematically destroyed. The physical memo absolutely did not demand a national apology or the abandonment of the policy. It strictly requested the target to stop acoustically transmitting the exact sequence his own staff mathematically knew would structurally fail to hold. Vance physically set the primary page down and immediately extracted the response document. The system logs it as a significantly shorter piece of physical paper possessing a brutal operational efficiency. Vance read the chief of staff's alphanumeric reply, actively dropping his acoustic volume to the precise frequency of an operator who cognitively understands that elevating the volume will grant the opposition permission to classify the moment strictly as theater. POTUS reviewed, he read. He wants to keep the line as is. It pulls at 78% favorability. Vance executed a micropause, then delivered the terminal sentence with absolute geometric stillness, allowing the optical camera arrays to lock onto the facial parameters of every biological entity surrounding the table. If we caveat it, we lose the message. The forensic system registers a total atmospheric collapse within the hearing room. The space systematically ceased functioning under its standard operational parameters. The low-frequency electrical hum of the fluorescent lighting architecture, positioned directly above the dais, became physically audible, strictly because 0 biological subjects occupying the grid were willing to execute a respiratory cycle loudly enough to register on the audio sensors. Within the press coordinate, a physical pen mechanically rolled off the geometric edge of a table and impacted the synthetic carpet. The physical sound registered as soft and mathematically tiny, yet the acoustic wave traveled across the entire spatial coordinate simply because all larger baseline sounds had completely retreated. Vance placed the document at the terminal end of the physical row, establishing the 8th white rectangle. The algorithmic system calculates that this final document systematically mutated the structural meaning of all 7 previous pages. The initial documents mathematically proved broken promises. The 8th document officially proved premeditation. If we caveat it, we lose the message Vance acoustically repeated, maintaining the exact same frequency and pacing. He transmitted the repetition strictly to ensure the mechanical stenographer permanently logged the sequence into the public transcript that would permanently survive long after the camera arrays powered down. He summarized the physical evidence. The target's own staff had mathematically presented him with a document bearing a verified seal and a specific negative integer of 5 to 8 million. They had provided the absolute softest operational alternative, say most people. Vance manually removed his optical glasses and placed them upon the stack. He transmitted that the target's response fundamentally bypassed all protocols of truth-telling, prioritizing the 78% polling parameter strictly, because the lie tested mathematically better than the truth within the focus group architecture. "You didn't misspeak," Mr. President, Vance stated, his optical sensors locked on to Obama. "You didn't oversimplify a complicated policy." He mechanically cut away every remaining operational escape route, transmitting the brutal, stripped-down reality. 5 million civilian subjects lost their physical health insurance strictly because the mathematical poll number mattered exponentially more to the executive than the accurate caveat. The system immediately shifts all optical tracking directly to the primary target to monitor the kinetic fallout. Barack Obama's physical body executed a critical, involuntary biological tell. His left biological hand moved directly below the surface of the mahogany table, tracking downward to rest upon his physical knee, systematically exiting the clean optical line of the camera arrays. Simultaneously, his right biological hand traveled vertically to his textile tie. He physically adjusted the knot exactly 1/4 of a geometric turn. The forensic algorithm categorizes this specific dual movement sequence as highly abnormal and structurally devastating. The historical data logs verify that Obama mathematically does not fidget. He systematically does not leak kinetic nervous energy through careless physical motion. He strictly prevents his biological body from optically contradicting his acoustic voice unless the vocal machinery has fundamentally exhausted its operational ground. The system calculates this specific adjustment was absolutely not vanity. It registered as the verified physiological tell of a biological operator whose physical body had suddenly initiated an automatic search for a manual kinetic task strictly because maintaining absolute physical stillness had become mathematically impossible to sustain. The forensic algorithmic system records that J.D. Vance maintained absolute physical stasis, systematically remaining seated at his designated coordinate. He mathematically refused to execute a theatrical courtroom finish, strictly rejecting the physical parameters of pacing in front of a jury or pointing directly at the witness table like a television lawyer attempting to win the evening broadcast. He remained locked exactly where he had been stationed. From the initiation of the sequence, sleeves rolled, biological hands positioned close to the physical documents, projecting the kinetic profile of an operator who had structurally arrived, not to overpower the target, but strictly to force the target to answer the specific parameters of politics that acoustic speeches systematically escape. Vance initiated his terminal acoustic sequence. He transmitted the alphanumeric assessment that Obama constituted the greatest speaker of his chronological generation, and mathematically, perhaps, of any generation. The system calculates this specific complement registered as structurally merciless strictly because it exponentially increased the kinetic weight of the underlying charge. When you talk, people listen, Vance transmitted. When you pause, people wait. When you say the word hope, people believe it. The algorithmic parameters map this sequence as the absolute core of the indictment. The structural trust the target successfully summoned functioned as the exact mechanism that made the subsequent broken promises exponentially damaging to the civilian grid. Vance did not deny the acoustic gift. He systematically named it, verified it as real, and subsequently weaponized it directly against the operator. Vance inputted a localized historical memory. He logged the physical parameters of observing Obama's previous acoustic speeches with his biological grandmother, utilizing a television hardware unit featuring a broken mechanical antenna, physically holding the apparatus at a specific geometric angle strictly to maintain the optical picture. Following one of those transmissions, Vance reported his grandmother's exact acoustic output. That man talks so good, it makes you forget to check if he is telling the truth. The system logs this alphanumeric line, settling over the spatial coordinate as an absolute structural verdict, originating from a biological subject who mathematically possessed zero institutional need for a fellowship, a think tank, or a Sunday broadcast invitation to cognitively process the oldest operational trick in the political architecture. Vance explicitly transmitted that he had systematically executed the check. He mathematically summarized the physical receipts, exactly 7 promises, 7 dates, 7 verified lies, 1 internal staff memorandum warning the primary promise was mathematically false, and 1 executive decision strictly prioritizing the polling integer over the truth. He reiterated the coordinate data. The target promised hope while Middletown structurally received heroin. The target promised change while manufacturing infrastructure mutated into parking lots. The target promised civilian subjects could retain their medical operators while 5 million mathematically could not. The target promised transparency while prosecuting the biological operators attempting to enforce it. The target promised 0 subjects left behind while military veterans physically died waiting on hidden administrative spreadsheets. Mama did not live to see the hearing, Vance transmitted. The system records the kinetic weight of this data point, systematically moving the confrontation off the Washington grid directly back to the physical residential structure where the initial belief sequence had commenced. She biologically terminated within a neighborhood the target's acoustic speeches systematically mentioned while his active policies structurally forgot. Vance relayed her terminal operational advice: watch what they do, not what they say. Vance physically retrieved his optical glasses, mechanically folded the hinges, and placed the hardware directly beside the 8th memorandum. The acoustic wave of the small mechanical click traveled across the spatial coordinate, carrying absolute finality. He transmitted his terminal sequence. He had systematically observed what the target did, and the physical reality was that the target delivered the greatest acoustic speeches in modern history while mathematically breaking every promise contained within them. That's all I have, Vance outputted. The system logs this as the cleanest mathematical termination point available. The committee chairman subsequently prompted the primary target to respond. All optical arrays immediately locked back onto the operator who had constructed a massive public architecture strictly out of never appearing, cornered by alphanumeric language. Obama initiated his acoustic output. I appreciate he commenced and immediately executed a measured pause. The system calculates this pause utilized the exact same geometric shape, breath length, and professional silence he had successfully deployed thousands of times to mathematically force audiences to lean their biological bodies forward. However, the physical reality of the chamber had permanently mutated. The biological female positioned in the second row mathematically did not lean. The male subject adjacent to her executed zero kinetic movement. The Democratic staffer remained physically locked in their exact coordinate. The room fundamentally ceased obeying the target's acoustic silences. The forensic system logs the mechanical failure. An acoustic pause that structurally holds an answer mathematically generates gravity. A pause that holds absolutely nothing leaves the biological subjects entirely static. Obama attempted to reboot the sequence. He acknowledged the vice president's remarks, then executed a significantly longer pause. His optical sensors failed to lock onto a target, drifting into the geometric middle distance where an alphanumeric sentence was theoretically supposed to materialize. "I have always believed," he transmitted, then suffered a mechanical halt. The optical arrays recorded a microscopic kinetic movement within his biological jaw, logging the physical profile of an operator, systematically testing words behind his teeth, and immediately calculating they would fundamentally fail to survive the room's atmospheric pressure. He outputted the fragment public service, then halted again. The forensic system logs these acoustic fragments as structurally catastrophic. The optical feed displayed the real-time mechanical failure of a highly optimized cognitive instrument. The biological operator who possessed the verified capability to output alphanumeric sequences for 45 continuous minutes without utilizing written notes, who could mathematically modulate the temperature of a massive hall strictly utilizing a single acoustic pause, was completely incapable of operating his own machinery. He finally transmitted his terminal output. "I stand by the work we did." The system records exactly 6 alphanumeric words originating from an operator who historically engineered massive political identities utilizing entire paragraphs. Each specific word was transmitted surrounded by massive mathematical volumes of empty acoustic space. The system tracks the immediate digital propagation of the event. The optical clip fractured across the global internet architecture preceding the termination of the chronological week. The data confirms civilian subjects were fundamentally not observing a standard political defeat. They were optically witnessing the most optimized political speaker currently functioning on the grid publicly discover that acoustic eloquence mathematically possesses a hard physical border. And that border operates strictly as a printed document bearing a chronological date. The long-form digital recording prompted the civilian grid to process an highly uncomfortable cognitive query. Did I believe him too? The systemic fallout initiated standard Washington operational protocols. House oversight immediately announced formal structural inquiries targeting internal communications. Federal subpoenas were systematically generated to extract the memoranda associated with the precise chronological months preceding the architecture's rollout. While the target faced zero legal jeopardy due to his inactive status, the political architecture rapidly initiated physical distancing parameters. 3 active Democratic operators structurally declined to occupy a spatial coordinate where he was scheduled to transmit an acoustic speech. A 4th biological operator attended but was optically recorded, maintaining a geometric distance of exactly 4 physical seats away from the target. The empty physical chair systematically mutated into its own brutal optical caption. The forensic system logs isolated data points across the grid. In Akron, Ohio, a biological male designated James, a military veteran who had previously voted for the target in 2008 and survived 2 kinetic combat tours, processed the digital recording. His medical ledger recorded exactly 14 chronological months of administrative hold music and automated voicemails while processing a spinal injury. Following the transmission, the subject cognitively calculated that he had successfully survived the physical waiting, but mathematically remained uncertain if his biological architecture had survived the believing. The algorithmic scan logs the terminal coordinates of the 2 primary operators. At the Naval Observatory, Vance physically occupied a coordinate with a yellow legal pad, mechanically executing handwritten text. He logged exactly 2 alphanumeric words, confirming his grandmother had structurally forced him to practice until the trajectory was straight. Simultaneously, at a spatial coordinate in Martha's Vineyard, Barack Obama physically occupied a study. The system logs a completely blank legal pad positioned directly in front of him. The biological operator fundamentally structured as a writer who processed systemic crises by locating the exact alphanumeric sentence to organize the data, physically failed to execute the task. The acoustic sentence fundamentally refused to materialize. The physical page remained mathematically blank. The systemic reality was locked into the grid. He mathematically had not misspoken. He had systematically chosen the numerical pole integer over the physical truth, and another operator had finally executed the mechanical check. Forensic audit officially complete. System shutdown finalized.